There's a famous quote, according to Jomo Kenyatta, saying, when the missionaries arrived, the Africans had the land and the missionary had the Bible. They taught us how to pray with our eyes closed. When we opened them, they had the land and we had the Bible. During a most dark and dismal time in our nation's history, we find the Africans who endured horrible circumstances during slavery found ways of peace and hope in their religious beliefs. During slavery, Africans were able to survive unbearable conditions by focusing on their spirituality. Christianity was amongst the slave community, being that the vast majority of the slave community was born in America. Converting slaves to Christianity was not a struggle. All slaves were not Christians, and slaves that had accepted Christianity were not official members of the church. Over time, slaves made Christianity their own. Africans firmly believe that there is a living community or a bond of life which makes for solidarity among members of the same family. The church was looked at as a place for political activity, a source of economic cooperation, an agency of social control, and a refuge in a hostile white world. Slaves worshiped with great enthusiasm. Religion, after all, provided a ready refuge for their daily miseries and kindled the hope that one day their sorrows might end. Planters actually encouraged religious observance among their slaves, hoping that exposure to Christian precepts might make their laborers more docile, less prone to run away, and more cooperative and efficient workers. But slaves turned biblical scripture to their own purpose, forging a theology that often emphasized the theme of liberation. It was easy for them to see, for example, in the figure of Moses, a useful model for their own dreams. Like the Israelites, they too were ready to cross a river Jordan into a promised land of freedom. As late as the 1800s, most slaves in the U.S. had not been converted to Christianity. In the years that followed, however, widespread Protestant evangelism emphasizing individual freedom and direct communication with God brought about the first large scale of conversion of enslaved men and women. At first, itinerant ministers captivating large audiences at revivals and camp meetings across the North and South during the middle part of the century reached only a small percentage of the slave population with their calls to Christianity. Large number of Black men and women were converted during the resurgence and intensification of revivalism during the Second Great Awakening of the late 1800s and the early 19th century. At that time, Baptist and Methodist ministers appealed to the slave and free Black populations, preached a plain style message of hope and redemption while also catering to manners of worship that African men and women carried with them to America, including spirit possession, call and response singing, shouting, and dancing. Whereas an earlier generation of evangelical preachers had opposed slavery in the South during the early 19th century, Protestant clergymen began to defend the institution, invoking a Christian hierarchy in which slaves were bound to obey their masters. For many slaveholders, this outlook not only made evangelical Christianity more palatable, but also provided a strong argument for converting slaves and establishing biracial churches. Even so, with much of the religious life of the slave community existing as an indivisible institution beyond the purview of whites or former churches, white control over African American religious practices and spiritual beliefs were limited. Slave preachers might emphasize the need for obedience to the master while whites were present, but among other slaves, they reformulated their teaching, emphasizing themes of suffering and redemption, slaves sang spirituals filled with lyrics about salvation and reference to biblical figures like Moses, who had led his people to freedom. On occasions, these songs function even more explicitly as expression of resistance, encoding messages about secret gatherings or carrying directions for escape. Slave religion is the belief, religious faith, and practices of Africans brought to the New World beginning in 1619, and that African Americans kept until they were emancipated. West Africans believe that there is a high God who created all things, and they believe on lesser gods who followed the high God. Having these lesser gods meant that they would pray to different gods when dealing with rain, fertility, and crops. They also believed that a status with the lesser gods was occupied by the spirits of the ancestors. Africans thought that their ancestors were the living dead because they were both close to the living as well as the ultimate beings. The purpose of them living was to honor their ancestors, recognizing the lesser gods, and give all power and admiration to the high God. Christianity became alive as slaves began to combine their American religious beliefs with Christian beliefs in order to make up what is called slave religion. At the beginning between 1619 and the early 1700s, slave owners were not really trying to convert their slaves into Christians. Then slave owners began to have different thoughts between each other as well. Some believed that slaves were more than inferior to this, meant that they should try to acquire Christian redemption. Others believed that converting slaves into Christians would cause many problems because they could start thinking that they were equal to the whites, since they were sharing the same beliefs. Then in 1701, this all began to change when white missionaries and slave masters realized that slaves should be converted into Christians. The formation in London of the Society for the Propagation of Gospel in Foreign Parts is how all this began. The number of slaves that converted was limited due to the lack of ministers that were sent to North America, and because some slaves owners objected to their slaves to be taught. Christians believed that SPG was converting slaves as they demanded control of their body instead of African beliefs, in which they emphasized the physical movement caused by spiritual possession. Slaves prayed secretly to God as their only master and asked for them to be liberated from their owners. They reinterpreted Christianity by adding some of their African religions. Slaves identified themselves with the Old Testament Hebrew slaves as they were liberated by God. If God was able to liberate the Hebrew slaves, that meant that if the slaves would pray enough to him, the same thing would take place for them. To them, faith was now a belief in and a commitment to God that helped the poor and judged the arrogant and the strong, their owners. Now God, instead of the plantation owners, was the actual master of the slaves. Slaves believed that if God had sided against religion and political powers in the Bible, then he could also help them become free. They believed that Jesus was powerful enough to do anything. Through their arrangement of God and Jesus, slaves were able to obtain a new meaning in their everyday life. They created things like discourse of solidarity, in which one slave would never give information about another, and even went to the extreme of religious resistance. Rebellion was now taking place. Invisible institutions was now clearly shown as slaves were conducting secret worship and prayer far away from the eyes of their masters. They would meet in the woods where they would get ready to receive a visit from the Spirit who made them sing, pray, preach, shout, and enjoy their own free religious place in such an enthusiastic manner. In the invisible institution, slaves learned things as oratorical skills and started becoming leaders. Some received food and clothing, but also counseling in order to keep in the right stage of mind. In the 1830s, during the religious awakening in the South, the slave owners were now bringing the gospel to the quarters, and this served as social control and as a way to convert slaves. By 1860, about 15% of the slaves were members of either the Baptist or the Methodist Church. There was a saying, as I conclude, there's a saying by Martin Luther King, one of the Black historical greatest heroes, dreamt of a day when Black and white children would walk together as sisters and brothers. While we've made a lot of progress toward this goal, we are still not walking together as countrymen. We won't and can't until we accomplish, teach, and learn our shared history, which means celebrating Black contributions to the building of this nation year-round.
In 1962, in my hometown, we were engaged in a very intense struggle against racial segregation, and there were mass jailings. At one point, a federal judge issued an injunction with names on it of the people they thought were the leaders of the movement. Reverend Samuel Wells was in Shiloh Baptist Church that night, and he said, "I'm not going to let no injunction turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round." Wait, I know this is a show, but you have to actually sing this song. You can never tell when you might need it. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom.
Baptist. On this final Sunday of Black History Month, I'm going to be speaking to you on music in the Black church. Music in the Black church roots in its earliest form was imported with the slaves themselves. They brought musical knowledge from West Africa and fashioned instruments out of wood such as drum, zithers, xylophones, and bongos. And a zither is an abbreviated form of the guitar without the long neck that they used in singing their songs. Music is one of the most distinguishable aspects of African American Christianity. Many historians trace African American music and dance back to the ring shout, a religious ritual that is the oldest documented performance style in this country. It is a dance where worshipers move in a circle while shuffling and stomping their feet and clapping their hands. It too originated in West Africa. For more than 2 centuries, African American churches have served as a means of inspiration and hope, which emphasize the meaning of individual transformation, even when the prevailing notion of the country did not advocate the fair treatment of Black people. Black theologians discussed the liberation of the marginalized and the injustices visited upon Blacks in America. Music is said to have eased the drudgery of their lives and was a source of hope and a method of communication. Communication through music of how to free slaves through the Underground Railroad and how to help teach our children who were barred from going to schools. Black gospel music originated in the southeastern United States, where most Black Americans lived prior to the Great Migration. Through the early Civil War, Jim Crow laws, and Civil Rights movement, Blacks depended on leaders and their spirituality to find inspiration in stories of deliverance. Many of the stories were through hymns, such as I'll Fly Away, Oh Happy Day, and Amazing Grace. A side note is that Amazing Grace lyrics were written by Captain John Newton. He was the captain of a slave ship, and he was white. It is thought that he penned these words as he listened to the continuous moans and groans of his captives in the bows of his ship. The melody of those sounds is what Amazing Grace is put to. John Newton eventually became an abolitionist, a person who fought against slavery. Music was another major turning point in the 20th century. After the Civil War, many outside of the Black community learned spirituals. Spirituals contributed greatly to the creation of secular music genres such as blues and jazz, but churches rejected those new creations. During the 1930s, Thomas Andrew Dorsey, a former blues piano player, began mingling blues with sacred music. He is known as the father of Black gospel music, and he wrote Precious Lord, Take My Hand. We all know that song. Mingling the blues with sacred music resulted in gospel music injecting more instrumentation and individuality into Black church music. Pentecostal holiness churches often had full bands that included drums and other instruments. By the 1950s, gospel music was a widely known product of the Black church, thanks to figures such as Rosetta Tharpe, Mahalia Jackson, and Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke brought a much greater attention to gospel music because of his popularity in pop music. Today, we have figures such as Shirley Caesar, Yolanda Adams, Donnie McClurkin, Kirk Franklin, and a host of others. These contemporaries continue to keep gospel music in the forefront with their amazing gift of song and their testimonies of what God can do. Spirituals became a way that African Americans could talk about who they were, about who they could be, despite what their particular situation was. These traditions continue today in the Black church. The people of God sing. Music and song continue to play a vital role in the life of God's people. It is a source of strength, hope, blessings, celebration, rejuvenation, glorification, and adulation. Step by step, we'll make this journey, even though the way seems hard. Step by step, we'll make this journey, but we must put our trust in God. We as a people are on this journey together, and with God's grace and mercy, we will persevere. Thank you.